The summer nights in County Kerry had a way of holding on to their secrets. Even in the warmest months, when darkness reluctantly gave way to dawn, there was something in the air that spoke of ancient things. Things that preferred to remain hidden in the shadows between twilight and sunrise. Michael Mick O'Connor knew these roads like the cards in his well-worn bridge deck, but on this particular night in 1947, the familiar would become frighteningly foreign. The evening had started normally enough at O'Sullivan's pub in Tralee, where Mick had spent hours engaged in his favorite pursuit, a spirited game of bridge, fueled by generous measures of Paddy's whiskey. The golden liquid had warmed his blood and sharpened his card play, or so he believed, as he bid and won hand after hand. The pub's smoky atmosphere and the quiet intensity of the game had kept him longer than usual, and it wasn't until the grandfather, clock in the corner, struck 2 that he finally pushed back his chair. "Sure you won't stay for one more, Mick?" called Danny O'Sullivan from behind the bar, already knowing the answer. Mick never stayed past closing, no matter how good the game or how sweet the whiskey. "Can't do it, Danny." "Got work in the morning?" Mick replied, patting his jacket pocket to ensure his cigarettes and wallet were where they belonged. The engineering plans for the new bridge in Listowel wouldn't draw themselves, and he prided himself on never letting his evening pursuits interfere with his professional responsibilities. The air outside had a bite to it that hadn't been there earlier. Mick's Austin 8 sat alone in the gravel lot, its black paint barely visible in the weak light of the pub's rear lamp. As he settled behind the wheel, the leather seat creaked a familiar welcome, and the engine turned over with a reassuring rumble. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. The drive from Tralee to his home outside Killarney usually took about an hour, following a route that wound through some of Kerry's most isolated countryside. Mick didn't mind the solitude. After an evening of cards and conversation, he welcomed the quiet time with his thoughts. The whiskey in his system made everything feel slightly softer around the edges, but he remained alert enough to navigate the narrow, hedge-lined roads with confidence. Passing through Castle Island, the streets were deserted save for a stray dog that watched his car with glowing eyes. The town's buildings huddled together against the night, their windows dark and shuttered. It was just beyond the last house, where the street lamps gave way to complete darkness, that Mick first saw the figure standing by the roadside. In the brief sweep of his headlights, the man appeared ordinary enough, dressed in dark clothes, standing perfectly still with his head slightly bowed. There was nothing particularly remarkable about his presence. Hitchhikers were common enough in these parts. Yet something about the way the man stood, so motionless in the night, sent an involuntary shiver down Mick's spine. The whiskey-warmed part of his brain reminded him of the common courtesy expected in rural Ireland. Nobody with a motorcar would pass a traveller on foot at this hour. It simply wasn't done. Before he could fully process his own actions, Mick found his foot easing off the accelerator, the car slowing to a stop beside the silent figure. The passenger door opened with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the still night air. Without a word, the man slid into the seat beside Mick. The interior light had burned out months ago, another small repair Mick had been meaning to get around to, leaving the stranger's features obscured in shadow. "Nasty night to be walking," Mick offered conversationally, putting the car back in gear. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, unanswered. The stranger remained perfectly still, facing forward, his silence as deep as the darkness outside. The car's headlights carved a path through the night, revealing the road in brief segments. Hedgerows loomed on either side, their branches reaching over the narrow lane like grasping fingers. Mick tried again. "Headed far?" Still no response. He'd encountered taciturn farmers before, men who lived alone in remote cottages and spoke to their animals more often than to other humans. But something about this silence felt different. heavier somehow, as if it were a physical presence in the car. The dashboard clock ticked softly, marking time in the oppressive quiet. Through the windscreen, Mick could see the first hint of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The grey light seemed to make the darkness around them more substantial rather than less. It was approaching the outskirts of the next village when Mick realized he didn't know where his passenger wanted to be let off. He turned to ask and felt his heart stutter in his chest. The passenger seat was empty. Mick's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles showed white. His mind raced through possibilities. Had the man somehow jumped out without him noticing? Had he imagined the whole thing? The whiskey in his system suddenly felt less like a comfort and more like a betrayal of his senses. He pulled the car over sharply, gravel crunching under the tires. The engine idled roughly as he sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The first birds of morning were beginning their chorus, the sound unnaturally loud in his ears. That's when he heard it, a roar that had no place in this empty countryside. It came from the field beyond the roadside ditch, a sound like hundreds of voices raised in excitement or anger. It reminded him of the crowds at football matches in Killarney, but magnified, distorted. Mick switched off the engine, half expecting the sound to stop. Instead, it grew clearer. Shouts, screams, the thunder of running feet. His hands were shaking as he opened the car door, but something stronger than fear pushed him forward. The ditch was steep, the grass wet with dew as he scrambled up. The field beyond lay empty in the strengthening dawn light, a few cattle grazing peacefully at its far end. Yet the sounds continued. Now he could make out individual voices, orders being shouted, the crack of what couldn't be anything but gunfire. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as a scream cut through the cacophony, a sound of such pure anguish that it seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. The cattle in the field raised their heads, but they showed no reaction to the otherworldly noise that filled the air. Mick stumbled backward, nearly falling as he scrambled down the ditch. He practically threw himself into the driver's seat, hands fumbling with the key. The engine refused to turn over once, twice, 3 times. Each failed attempt seemed to last an eternity as the sounds from the field grew louder, closer. Finally, the engine roared to life, and Mick pressed the accelerator to the floor, tires spinning in the gravel before finding purchase. He didn't slow down until he reached his own driveway, the sun now fully risen over the Kerry Mountains. The next day, nursing both a hangover and his shaken nerves, Mick mentioned the incident to his sister-in-law, Mary. She listened with growing excitement, her eyes wide as he described the vanishing passenger and the sounds from the empty field. "Where exactly did this happen?" she pressed, leaning forward in her chair. When Mick described the location, Mary's face went pale. "That field," she said softly. "That's where the ambush happened, back in 22. The IRA laid a trap for a British convoy. It turned into a bloodbath. Dozens of young men died there on both sides. They say the ground was soaked red for days after." Mick never drove that road at night again. He gave up his evening card games in Tralee, preferring to stick closer to home. When Mary would try to get him to talk about that night, especially in front of the children, he would shake his head and change the subject. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blew in from the west, Mick would find himself thinking about his silent passenger and the echoes of battle in that empty field. He would remember how the stranger had sat so still, staring ahead, as if seeing something far beyond the reach of the car's headlights, something lost in the mists of time and memory, something that still haunted the dark roads of Kerry. Years. Later, when Mary would tell the story to her grandchildren, she would watch their eyes grow wide with delicious fear, just as hers had when she first heard it. She knew the power of these tales, how they connected the present to the past, the living to the dead, the ordinary to the extraordinary. For in Ireland, especially in Kerry, the veil between worlds had always been thin, and stories like Mick's served as a reminder that some passengers never reach their final destination, and some battles never truly end. The rain pelted against my parents' windows like tiny fists demanding entry, each drop a harbinger of the terror that was about to unfold on that fateful night. The ancient grandfather clock in our hallway had just struck 2:30 a.m. when the doorbell shattered the peaceful silence of our home. Not a gentle ring, mind you, but a frantic, desperate hammering that seemed to echo through every corner of the house, setting our nerves on edge. I remember lying in bed, my heart pounding against my ribs as I heard my father's heavy footsteps thundering down the stairs. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, each step accompanied by barely contained fury at this midnight intrusion. The lights flickered to life throughout the house like falling dominoes, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. When the front door groaned open, the sight that greeted us was far from what any of us expected. There stood Paul, my sister's fiancé, a man I had known for years as the life of every party, the one who could crack a joke in any situation. But this wasn't the Paul we knew. This was a hollow shell of a man, drenched to the bone, his usually meticulously styled hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes. God, his eyes held a wild, haunted look that made my blood run cold. It grabbed. "Me," he whispered, his voice trembling like autumn leaves in a storm. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken horror. The living room lights cast strange shadows across Paul's face as he stood there, water pooling around his feet on our hardwood floor. My mother, ever the practical one, disappeared. Briefly, and returned with a thick towel, but Paul didn't even seem to notice as she draped it over his shoulders. His skin had taken on an ashen hue that made him look more like a corpse than a living person. I had known Paul for 3 years at this point. He was the kind of guy who would jump out from behind corners to scare people for fun, who would tell ghost stories around campfires and then orchestrate elaborate pranks to make everyone jump. But there was something different about him now. Something that made even my skeptical father, a man who scoffed at ghost stories and supernatural tales, lean forward with concern etched across his weathered face. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white bursts, and in those brief moments of clarity, I could see the fine tremors running through Paul's body. They weren't from the cold or the rain. This was pure, unadulterated fear. "I've heard it before," he finally continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but now it's touched me." Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort, as if speaking them aloud made the experience more real, more tangible. My father guided him to our worn leather couch, the one that had witnessed countless family gatherings and celebrations. But tonight it would bear witness to something entirely different. As Paul sank into the cushions, I noticed how his fingers dug into the leather, knuckles white with tension. The storm outside seemed to grow more intense, as if nature itself was providing a backdrop to the horror story about to unfold. What Paul didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that his late-night appearance at our doorstep would mark the beginning of a series of events that would challenge everything we believed about the world around us. The comfortable veil of reality we had wrapped ourselves in was about to be torn away, revealing something dark and ancient lurking just beneath the surface of our ordinary lives. He lived alone in what he had always jokingly called his bachelor pad, a modest efficiency apartment in the older part of town. The building itself dated back to the 1920s, with its Art Deco facade and wrought iron details that spoke of a more elegant era. But there was something else about that building, something that the rental agent had conveniently forgotten to mention when Paul signed his lease 12 months ago. Something that was about to turn his simple apartment into a nightmare. As lightning continued to flash outside our windows and thunder rolled across the sky like drums in a cosmic orchestra, Paul began to share his story. Each word that fell from his lips would paint a picture of escalating terror, of a presence that had been watching, waiting, and gradually making itself known in ways that would make even the most hardened skeptic question their beliefs about what was possible in our supposedly rational world. But before he could continue, my mother returned with a cup of hot tea, its steam rising like ghostly fingers in the dim light. Paul's hands shook so badly when he took it that small droplets splashed onto his already soaked jeans. None of us commented on it. We were all too focused on what he was about to reveal, too caught up in the mounting tension that seemed to fill every corner of our living room. In the brief pause that followed, I found myself studying the familiar features of our home. The family photos on the walls, the worn carpet beneath our feet, the comfortable furniture that had witnessed so many happy moments. These ordinary objects suddenly seemed like fragile barriers against the unknown that Paul was about to introduce into our lives. How quickly the familiar can become strange when darkness comes knocking at your door. The layout of Paul's apartment was simple enough. A perfect square divided by a half wall that separated the living room from his bedroom. From the east-facing entrance, you could walk straight through the living room into the kitchen with the bathroom tucked away behind a wall to the north. An L-shaped space that until recently had seemed perfectly ordinary. But as Paul began to describe what had been happening within those walls, the simple floor plan took on a more sinister aspect. It started small, he explained, his voice steadier now, but still holding an edge of barely contained panic. Just footsteps, the kind you might hear from upstairs neighbors, except, he paused, swallowing hard, except I live on the top floor. The footsteps, he told us, had followed a precise pattern from the very beginning. They would start at the entrance, moving with deliberate slowness toward the kitchen sink. The sound was distinct, not the hollow echo of shoes on hardwood, but something heavier, more purposeful, like someone walking with great intent, measuring each step. You know how you can tell when someone's exploring a space? Paul asked, his eyes fixed on some distant point. How they move differently than when they're just walking from point A to point B. That's what it was like, as if it was mapping out the territory. Over time, the pattern had expanded. The unseen presence began to venture further into his personal space, its nightly patrols extending beyond the kitchen into his bedroom. Paul described lying awake at night, tracking the sound as it moved along the side of his bed, feeling the temperature drop as it passed, hearing the subtle shift in the air. I tried to rationalize it, he continued, running a trembling hand through his still damp hair. Pipes settling, old building noises, but pipes don't change their routine, they don't adapt. The storm outside had settled into a steady drumbeat of rain, punctuated by occasional rumbles of thunder. Each flash of lightning seemed to make Paul flinch, as if expecting to see something materialize in the brief moments of illumination. His tea sat untouched on the coffee table, growing cold. Last week I started noticing other things. Small objects moving when I wasn't looking. Keys that I swear I left on the kitchen counter would end up by the door. My coffee mug would be in a different spot than where I left it. Little things, you know. The kind of things that make you question your own memory. My father, ever the pragmatist, tried to interject with logical explanations, but Paul cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. I know what you're thinking. Trust me, I thought of all that too. I even set up my phone to record while I was sleeping, trying to catch whatever was making the noise. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, but didn't make any move to play anything. The recordings, they're empty, just static and silence, but the footsteps, they got louder, more confident, like it knew I was trying to capture evidence and was mocking me. The atmosphere in our living room grew heavier with each word. Outside, tree branches scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers, and the wind had picked up, creating an eerie whistling through the eaves. Everything seemed to be conspiring to enhance the horror of Paul's tale. Then came the blinds, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Metal blinds. You know the type? The ones that make that distinct sound when you touch. Them? He demonstrated with his fingers, making a soft clicking noise that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. It would start at the top, just one or two slats at first. Click, 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 click. As he described it, I could picture the scene perfectly. Lying in bed, covers pulled up, listening to that methodical sound moving down the window like some invisible hand playing a macabre instrument. The very thought made my skin crawl. But tonight, Paul's voice cracked, and he had to take a moment to compose himself. Tonight was different. The pacing started as usual, but something had changed. The footsteps were heavier, more deliberate, and when it reached my bed, he rolled up his sleeve slowly, revealing what made us all gasp in unison. There, on his right forearm, was an angry red handprint. But this was no ordinary mark. The fingers were massive, the palm broad and powerful, like the hand of a giant. The skin around it was raised and inflamed, as if he had been grabbed with tremendous force. My mother immediately went to fetch some ointment, her practical nature taking over in the face of a tangible problem to solve. But we all knew this was beyond the help of any medicine. The mark wasn't just a bruise or a burn, it was evidence, proof that something impossible had reached out from the darkness and made contact. I ran, Paul said simply. Didn't even grab my keys or my wallet. Just ran down 3 flights of stairs in the rain until I reached your door. He looked up at us, his eyes pleading for understanding, for confirmation that he wasn't losing his mind. The silence that followed was deafening. What could any of us say in the face of such evidence? The handprint stood out stark and accusatory, against his pale skin, impossible to dismiss or explain away. It was as if reality itself had been torn, revealing something dark and ancient, lurking just beneath the surface of our ordinary world. The culmination of Paul's terrifying experience unfolded in vivid detail as he recounted those final moments in his apartment. The storm that had driven him to our door was still raging outside, but it paled in comparison to the tempest of horror he had fled from. I was lying there, trying to do what I'd always done, pretend it wasn't real, keep the covers over my head like a child hiding from monsters, Paul continued, his voice stronger now, as if the very act of telling the story was helping him process the trauma. The rain was getting heavier and lightning was flashing almost continuously. That's when everything changed. He described how the familiar pattern of footsteps had suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. A heavy, expectant quiet that seemed to press against his ears. Even through the blanket, he could feel the air growing colder, as if all the warmth was being sucked out of the room. Then the blinds started, he said, demonstrating again with his fingers. But this time, it wasn't just the usual clicking. It was like whatever was there had lost all pretense of subtlety. The sound got faster and faster, more violent with each passing second, like a countdown to something terrible. Lightning flashed outside our windows as if on cue, and Paul's face went pale at the memory. That's when I heard the ripping sound. The entire set of blinds just tore away from the window, not falling, not breaking. They were ripped away with such force that they flew across the room. He paused, taking a shuddering breath. I knew I shouldn't look. Everything in me was screaming not to look, but I did. God help me, I did. The thing he saw standing beside his bed defied description. In the strobing lights of the storm, it appeared as a mass of dense shadows that seemed darker than the darkness around it. It had a vaguely humanoid shape, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad, with limbs that seemed to stretch and contract in impossible ways. It was looking right at me, Paul whispered. I don't know how I knew that, because it didn't have eyes. At least, none that I could see. But I could feel its attention, like a physical weight pressing down on me. And then, he touched the handprint on his arm, wincing at the contact. It reached out. The movement was so fast I couldn't even react. One moment it was just standing there, and the next I felt this burning grip on my arm. The pain was. It was like ice and fire at the same time, like it was trying to mark me down to my soul. What happened next was pure instinct. Paul described throwing off his covers and running, not even fully conscious of his movements. He remembered the sound of something moving behind him, a sort of sliding, shuffling noise that seemed to fill the entire apartment. The door handle felt like it was frozen when he grabbed it, but somehow he managed to wrench it open. As I ran down the stairs, I could hear it, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Not footsteps anymore, but this sound, like fabric being torn, or reality itself coming apart at the seams. It followed me down 2 flights before it stopped. The mark on his arm seemed to pulse in the dim light of our living room, a testament to the reality of his encounter. None of us could take our eyes off it. The clear outline of fingers that were far too large to belong to any human hand, the angry red color that suggested both burning heat and freezing cold. The aftermath of that night changed everything. Paul never returned to his apartment alone. The next morning, my father and I accompanied him to collect his belongings, though he seemed reluctant to even step through the doorway. The apartment appeared normal in the daylight, almost mockingly so, except for the blinds that lay twisted and mangled in the corner of his bedroom. The handprint remained visible for 3 days, gradually fading from angry red to purple, then to a pale blue before disappearing entirely. But even after it vanished, Paul would sometimes rub that spot on his arm as if feeling a phantom pain or remembering the terrible cold of that otherworldly touch. He broke his lease that very morning, explaining to his landlord in vague terms about disturbances and safety concerns. What surprised us was the landlord's reaction, a knowing look, a quick agreement to terminate the contract without penalty, and a hurried goodbye that suggested this wasn't the first time such a complaint had been made. Later, through careful research, we discovered that the building had a history. Not the dramatic, blood-soaked past you might expect, but something more subtle. A pattern of short-term tenants, especially in the units on the top floor. People who would move in full of enthusiasm about the affordable rent and prime location, only to leave abruptly within a year, often breaking their leases and forfeiting their deposits just to get out. Paul stayed with my family for several weeks after the incident, sleeping in our guest room with the lights on. Eventually, he found a new apartment in a different part of town, a modern building with no history and no unexplained noises in the night. But the experience left an indelible mark on him. visible not in the long-vanished handprint, but in the way he would tense up at unexpected sounds, the way his eyes would dart to dark corners, the way he would never again sleep with his back to an open room. As for the entity in his old apartment, we never learned what it was or why it chose to reveal itself to Paul in such a dramatic way. Perhaps it was territorial, marking its domain in an increasingly crowded world. Or maybe it was lonely, reaching out in the only way it knew how to make contact with the living. Whatever its nature or purpose, it left us all with a profound understanding that there are things in this world that defy explanation, forces that exist just beyond the edges of our ordinary reality. The building still stands, its Art Deco facade maintaining its elegant appearance, giving no hint of what might lurk within its walls. New tenants come and go, and sometimes, late at night, if you pass by and look up at the windows of the top floor, you might see the metal blinds moving ever so slightly when there isn't any wind. Some stories don't have neat endings. Some mysteries remain unsolved. But the mark left by that night, both physical and psychological, serves as a reminder that sometimes the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond can become very thin indeed. And when it does, all we can do is run and hope that whatever reaches out from the darkness doesn't leave a permanent mark on our souls.